But it was in the 17th century that scientists and philosophers perfected the methods which really opened up new paths to Western humanity. We must first draw a distinction here between science and technique. The Greeks had already developed the rules of scientific observation and, up to a point, of scientific experimentation. They were familiar with the idea of natural law to such an extent that in this respect the moderns were not innovators. But with a few exceptions, the ancients were content to confine themselves to the sphere of theory. They were more anxious to think over things, a more noble function from their standpoint than to seek after material progress. They lived in the mild climate of the Mediterranean, which did nothing to make the preoccupations of everyday life an imperative matter. Archimedes even apologized for his ingenious inventions. Within a civilization whose center was shifted to the northwest of Europe, it became imperative for man to fight against cold, damp, and the vagaries of the climate in general. He was compelled by necessity to turn his attention to the problem of making his daily existence more agreeable. In these conditions, science began to go beyond mere contemplation, and technique prepared to go beyond science. Doubtless, where the scientists and thinkers were concerned, the urge to know remained the dominant impulse. But science no longer dissociated itself from the application of its discoveries. Incidentally, it was the man's thought which furnished him with the means. Baconian experimentalism is the source of modern efficiency, whilst Cartesianism potentially contained American rationalization. It was these 17th century masters of thought, the successors of the ancient Greeks, who by methods they perfected made possible the tremendous industrial expansion of the 19th and 20th centuries. Mechanism, as practiced in the West, would not have been possible without science and without Greek reasoning, something which the East does not possess today any more than it did yesterday. Uh, However, this mechanism is above all a technique. It is the harnessing of factors of nature in the service of man, whereby the latter's power is immeasurably increased. The tool, the instrument of the Neolithic age, was put into operation only by the muscular energy of man, which was, of course, strictly limited. The machine, on the other hand, has no longer any relation with the physical strength of man, and its productive possibilities are unlimited, so much so that to us nothing any longer seems impossible in this respect. An entirely new form of social life has arisen as a consequence of this fact, because science as harnessed in the service of industry is a very different thing from science as objective curiosity. It is transformed into a discipline applied to facts in order to bend them to the requirements of man. The dominant factor is now the will of power, the impatience to open up and exploit the whole world. Man is master of his actions, but he is no longer master of himself. He is carried away by a sort of indisciplined romanticism. To quote Barres again, it is method in the service of passion. It is, in short, not a distinct period of history, but a new age in the life of humanity. After the Neolithic or the Tool Age follows the age of the machine. It goes parallel with the policy of ruthless and frantic exploitation of natural resources of the earth without the least thought for the future. And this is in part the explanation of that impression of sudden and immeasurable riches conveyed by a civilization which is wasting its substance. For a century and a half, the West possessed a monopoly of science and of mechanized industry, but as a result, its power became irresistible. The balance which existed between Europe and Asia in the 17th century was upset, and the latter, discovering tardily that Western technique was synonymous with political domination, was forced to assimilate it, less from admiration than from a desire to defend itself. Today, all continents, all countries, all peoples clamour after the machine. But it is one thing to use a machine once it is made, and quite another to invent it or to replace it. And it is this circumstance which forms the basis, still solid despite everything on which Western superiority rests. Outwardly, it is a question of technical progress, but in reality, the success of the West depends on factors every bit as complex as the remote and varied sources from which it stems. It is at this point that we can see the possibility of a crisis on the horizon of our civilization. Its technique derives essentially from its culture, and in denying its culture or in leaning too far towards the technical side, it would risk compromising the very sources of its own validity. Western civilization developed in a certain geographic environment. Originally, it was the Mediterranean, and more particularly of the Eastern Mediterranean. By comparison with the Asiatic continental mass, Greek life was maritime, articulated, and diverse. Rome, whose structure was less diverse, still remained Mediterranean. Subsequently, it was in Central and Northwest Europe that the industrial system developed, which characterizes the modern West. Although today the center of technological progress tends to shift to the New World, it is still in the Old that we must look for its primary impulse. Thus, geographical circumstances, easily recognizable, are at the origin of our civilization. First of all, and particularly in the Mediterranean, there was a geographical environment, so to speak, of human proportions, in which nature did not overwhelm man and did not appear disproportionate in relation to him and his activities. Man is the measure of all things, proclaimed Protagoras, the Greek sophist. It is a characteristic axiom, and Paul Valery has called it essentially Mediterranean, but one could equally say that it was essentially European. In our old continent, at least where it really is itself, one has the impression that man is adapted to nature. The same is true of the climate, temperature, temperate and oceanic, and never aggressively continental. It is a climate of long semi-seasons. It makes for neither overstimulation nor for deep depression. On the contrary, it lends itself to measured effort, with results that can be calculated in advance. In such an environment, a proper relation exists between the human being and the natural surroundings in which he lives, and Europe is unquestionably the only continent in which this is true. The consequences are obvious. The possibility of fitting the effort to the aim pursued is productive of morality, or at least of a certain reasonable sense of conduct, including an exact idea of time and space. Where the geographical structure is formidable, where the climate runs to extremes, as in the case in Africa, Asia, and America, this sort of moral balance of conduct does not develop so fully. Labor there is either too easy or too difficult, and there is no established or relation between the effort exerted and the result obtained. Hence the spirit of speculation, which claims to reap without waiting, or the ignorance of the tiller of the soil, who thinks he can take anything he likes out of it without ever exhausting it. The European peasant is, on the other hand, very well aware that man's powers in this respect are limited, and that a certain quantity of production corresponds necessary to a certain amount of effort. It may be that war has compromised this economic morality even with us, but when we compare our actions and our ways of production with those of other races, even with those of non-European whites, we can we cannot but recognize that Europe has developed a labor morale which is one of the principal factors of its success. Not all white men are associated with Western civilization, and those in the East have remained unwilling to join it. Nevertheless, although Western civilization is the result of a certain environment, it is also the work of a race, the white race, and the white race alone made Western civilization. The distance which separates them from the black or the red-skinned man is enormous, and although the yellow-skinned man, or the yellow-skinned men, have shown themselves capable of a comparable efficiency, they suffer technically from 3 centuries of backwardness. In these conditions, our civilization corresponds to a geographical sphere whose limits it is interesting to define. In the days of antiquity, the East was distinct from that which was not called the West, from that Greek world which was to devise a new way of thought. The Aegean Sea, with the Greek cities on the Asiatic coast, corresponded to a civilization which was different from that of the Persians, which was Eastern. When, in the days of Alexander, Hellenism extended as far as India, it seemed that the frontier of the West had been pushed forward at least 1,200 miles towards the East. But it was a temporary wave only, and from the 2nd century of our era, the East reclaimed all its old rights and orientalized the Greek conquest again. With the limes now fixed in Syria at the edge of the desert of a certain geographical boundary, always the same, thus tended to reappear. But with the Arabs, it was the East which now spilled over into Europe, in the Mediterranean as far as the Atlantic. The Arabs were more civilized than Europe, and it was they who possessed those qualities of initiative and that intellectual liberty which later on were to form the grandeur of the West. Finally, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire and its breakup, the old frontiers reappeared. Where are those frontiers? It would seem that the shores of the Mediterranean, penetrated to some extent, though they are by Eastern influences, continue to belong to the West, by contrast to the continental hinterland. On the coasts, the commercial ports of the Levant belong to the West, as distinct from those of the interior, which are real ports of the desert and have often been called bazaars. Whilst Alexandria, Beirut, and Tripoli are Mediterranean, Cairo, Jerusalem, Damascus, and Aleppo live in another climate and depend on another world. There is a contrast here between two geographical zones, between two civilizations, and it is not for nothing that the Mediterranean is sometimes referred to as the anti-desert. We must recognize, too, that the East begins with Islam, which has recaptured everything conquered by Greece and Rome in Asia. The life of the desert and its great spaces have, in short, not been westernized. They belong to the East, and that is why they have returned to it. Between continental Europe and Asia, the line of demarcation is less clear. Properly speaking, the West consists of Western and Central Europe, after which, towards the East, there is a gradual falling away. The time belts divide Europe very accurately into zones of civilizations. When the traveler across Europe reaches the Russian time belt, he is perhaps not yet in Asia, but he is no longer altogether in Europe, and he has certainly left the West behind him. And finally, in the extreme West, there is part of our civilization which is no longer European, the United States, the dominions of Great Britain, and the countries of Central and South America, at least to the extent to which the white race is dominant in them. On the periphery, too, we must add those white colonies rather than their settlements, which are administered by whites, and which thus represent something like a march. But we must leave out of account those countries which, although they have accepted our technique and even the outward appearance of our material civilization, nevertheless continue to owe their spiritual allegiance elsewhere. From this point of view, Egypt, Pakistan, and Hindustan do not fully belong to our family, and it is in this respect that the unity, fundamentally Christian, of the Western world appears, a unity which is perhaps its strongest bond of all, that humanism, that sense of pity and of charity, which, in the words of St. Paul, covers a multitude of sins. In the light of these distinctions, and once we have cleared away a whole undergrowth of pretensions, outward appearances, and hypocrisy, the true spirit of Western civilization is seen with reasonable clarity. Fundamentally, the West believes and proclaims that man can and should be the master of his own destiny. Western man does not wait passively for heaven to bring him to happiness. He takes a hand himself, and having determined the aims to be followed and the means to be employed to achieve them, His attitude is the negation of fatalism and passivity. The accent is placed on the material and social aspect of things, and it is less a matter of mysticism than of human progress.